Among the different disciplines within ecology, ecosystem ecology is a relatively young discipline. That ecosystem ecology really wasn't recognized as being a separate discipline within ecology until relatively recently. I would probably say the 1960s was the birth of ecosystem ecology as a discipline. And that's a relatively short amount of time. But the history of ecosystem ecology predates that by far. That a lot of contributions were being made, a lot of understanding was being generated about the ecology of ecosystems, about ecosystem ecology, that goes back hundreds of years. And so when we work as ecosystem ecologists today, that we're standing on the shoulders of people long, long ago, that we're starting to try and understand the pools and fluxes of energy and material. They didn't call what they were doing ecosystem ecology, often it went by other names, but ecosystem ecology draws on a broad range of disciplines. And what the authors state is that many early discoveries of biology were motivated by questions about the integrated nature of ecological systems. The same types of questions that we have today that we recognize as questions about ecosystem ecology are ones that people had asked before in a slightly different manner. And what's important to realize is that ecosystem ecology draws from many disciplines, that it's not a relatively narrow field, it's a broad field. And what we'll be talking about throughout this course is going to draw on lots of different disciplines. Now, what the authors show in this figure 1.3, is that as far as ecosystem ecology is concerned, here in the middle, that the different disciplines it draws on, for example, really represent different levels of mechanism or context. So in some cases, the disciplines that we draw on them in order to provide mechanism for some of the questions that we ask. And in other cases, ecosystem ecology is the mechanism for other disciplines, for example, or those disciplines provide the context for the questions that we ask. So at the bottom, for example, they have listed physiological ecology. And physiological ecology is basically the study of organisms, their physiology, and how it impacts their ecology. And a lot of the principles that we have in ecosystem ecology are derived from those that were generated by physiological ecologists. So studying organisms and how they interact with their environment, that's physiological ecology, and that's a lot of what we do as ecosystem ecologists. In addition, you'll see a lot of the principles that we have come out of population ecology and community ecology. I'll give examples where a lot of the dynamics of those ecosystems, so for example, the response to fire, is being driven by the population ecology of different species that are present in ecosystems. And it's really what would have been considered at one point strict population ecology that determines the properties of ecosystems and their dynamics. Same thing with community ecology. Community ecology spent a lot of time taking a look at the flow of energy and materials among biotic components. That's a good part of community ecology, and that becomes a big part of ecosystem ecology too. You'll also see that we'll have a lot of questions about how soils work in geochemistry, biogeochemistry, and that's a big component of ecosystems. Soils are an important component in ecosystems, and to that same degree, we're going to think about geochemistry and soil science, things that soil scientists or people that consider themselves geochemists would have traditionally done. Excuse me. That's on the mechanistic side of things. In contrast, there's context for what we do as ecosystem ecologists also. And up here, when we think about, for example, how societies work, something we call social ecological stewardship, that provides the context. Those are the sets of questions that ecosystem ecologists can provide information so that people that are working on the interface between societies and ecosystems and how we take care of them, for example, can make better decisions. And also, Earth system science, for example, really thinks about the Earth as an entire system, and that's even broader than ecosystem ecology. But ecosystem ecology ends up being a component of that. And you'll see, especially in the next chapter, we're going to think a lot about what's been more traditionally atmospheric science, climatology, hydrology. Again, important components to ecosystems, but also ecosystem ecology forms a component of the things that they study. And these happen at often much broader scales than what we measure on ecosystem ecology. Now, thinking about all the different disciplines that contribute to modern ecosystem ecology, you don't have to understand everything about each of those disciplines. That being said, there are a lot of things to learn, and what we're covering in this course is going to draw from population, it's going to draw from community ecology, it's going to draw from biogeosciences and atmospheric sciences, and we're going to have to think about societies and how they work, how humans work too, as parts of those ecosystems. There are going to be a lot of things to learn from a lot of different disciplines. As we go through and try and understand the history of ecosystem ecology better, it's important to think about where a lot of the ideas that we have came from. If we go back and look at the history of some of these disciplines, we're going to find that a lot of the principles that were set up and the approaches that we use go back hundreds of years, for example. Now, to understand ecosystem ecology doesn't necessarily mean that you need to understand all of those different components. You don't have to understand everything about population, physiological ecology, community ecology, climatology, all of those things that we said are components or contribute to that, nor do we have to understand all of the history of different observations and discoveries that were made by people that are now contributing to modern ecosystem ecology. That being said, as you read through the book and you look at the examples that are provided, it's really instructive to understand how far back these things go and where some of these concepts came from. So for example, one of the earliest sets of measurements that you could imagine being an ecosystem ecologist doing was done by Joseph Priestley. And if you take a look at the date of his book, Experiments and Observations on Different Kinds of Air, that's somewhere on the order of 1,500, 700, 1775. So that goes back a long time. And what Priestley had done, if you take a look here, is basically grow plants in different types of jars where he could isolate the atmosphere that's produced by these plants from the atmosphere of the laboratory and take a look at essentially the production of gases from plants. And associated with that, he also would put animals in different jars and take a look at how they interacted with that. And so this is something relatively recognizable in the sense that even back in the 1700s, we were taking a look at interactions between organisms and the atmosphere. It's the same different thing. And although we don't necessarily use the same techniques that Priestley would have done, we often, by putting plants in chambers or animals in chambers, really use the same approach. And it's been constant, this idea of trying to isolate organisms from their environment since the late 1700s. Now, another person who really is an important person in ecosystem ecology is Justus von Liebig, and we're going to talk a lot about limitation, and it was really Liebig that had done the work, and along with somebody else, other people during that time, in the mid-1800s. And this is the time when fertilizers were first starting to be understood, inorganic fertilizers, and he had really started to lay out some of the ideas of limitation that we build upon today. We build upon it, we've adapted it in many ways and improved upon it. And I'll talk a little bit about that later too. But understand that 1700s, mid-1800s, a lot of these discoveries were being made that are really still important today and we're still trying to understand. Now, another person that figures prominently in ecosystem ecology is Henry Coles. So although his name looks like it should be pronounced Cowles, it's actually Coles. And Henry Coles was at the University of Chicago, and he had studied succession. But really what's so important about Coles' work, and you'll read a little bit about this, is the gradient approach. And throughout this entire course, we're often going to use gradients to understand how ecosystem processes, different factors control ecosystem processes and the structure of ecosystems. And Coles was one of the first people to do this. So he worked at Indiana Dunes off of Lake Michigan and set up gradients from the edge into the interior of the forest. So we went from the beach, open beach, to beach grass into older forests. And along that way, use that gradient, that spatial gradient, to understand temporal gradient. Because here, these are old beaches here, younger beaches as you got closer to the lake. And he would use this gradient to understand how succession worked over longer time scales than we could actually observe as individuals. Henry Coles was really important as far as setting a set of ideas up and producing students, helping shape students that you can recognize that influence even today. So we'll talk about the gradient approach, and we'll talk about succession, and a lot of this started with Henry Coles in the late 1800s, so well over 100 years ago. Charles Elton really figures prominently too. He was a person who in the early 1900s to mid 1900s really started to think about trophic dynamics and how energy and materials passed through organisms through a number of different processes. He coined the term niche, and he really was the person who started to think about food chains, and we'll talk about those in future chapters. And you could see that even though his seminal work was 1927, that still ecosystem ecologists are thinking about his legacy. And there was just an issue that came out in the Journal of Animal Ecology in 2011 that was thinking about the legacy of Charles Elton. The discoveries that he made, the concepts that he put down in 1927 were still influencing people in 2011. Although Elton is considered a community ecologist, somebody who studied the interaction among organisms, the types of interactions that are there often get subsumed into ecosystem ecology because there's transfers of energy and materials associated with them. Ray Lindemann is also a person that figures relatively prominently. Lindemann's career was relatively short, and it never really got past graduate school. But in 1942, for all intents and purposes, he drew out the first food web. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about pools and fluxes in this. And you can see in 1942, he had gone to a lake and started to try and figure out what the major pools were and the major fluxes. And this idea of having pools and having fluxes, having interactions, effects, feedbacks, really came out of Lindemann's sketches that were published back in the 40s. And in this case, what we're going to do is not anything different than what Ray Lindemann had done in 1942. And some of his work had really set the scale for how ecosystem ecologists represent ecosystems and think about how they function. So that was 1942. The term ecosystem wasn't necessarily coined by Arthur Tansley in 1935, but that's when he promoted it. It was somebody else's term that somebody had come up with for Tansley. And the paper that it comes out of, so when we talk about ecosystems, that word first appeared in 1935. And it's in this paper here, The Use and Abuse of Vegetational Concepts and Terms, when you can see that he goes through some of these things that we talk about, succession that Coles had worked on, and climax communities that we'll talk about a little bit later. But it's right here that the term ecosystem first appears. And so 1935 was when people really started to think about how organisms interact with their environment. And then we came up with a term that then really represented an idea and took off. It's really difficult to talk about ecosystem ecology and the history of ecosystem ecology without talking about the Odoms, Eugene and Howard Odom. And much of what we do is based on, when it really crystallized, was with the Odom's career in the systems ecology. And they had borrowed ideas from a lot of other disciplines, such as engineering and electrical engineering, for example, to build on those previous ideas that Lindemann might have done or Elton might have done to really represent ecosystems. And we'll talk about systems ecology, for example. And that was really the Odom brothers that were important here. And you can see when they started to represent ecosystems that this pool and flux idea really became crystallized. That they really said, we're going to take our ecosystems and divide it up into components and then really think about the fluxes of those. And modern ecosystem ecology is really thought of as being born with the Odom brothers and some of their approaches. That does, what I just said does not do them justice, and even what's in the book does not do their contribution justice. But if you're going to think about ecosystem ecology and you want to know the history, understanding systems ecology and Eugene and Howard Odom is really important. In summary, it's really important to recognize that ecosystem ecology is a broad discipline. It draws on physiological ecology, population ecology, community ecology, disciplines that were relatively distant from those other disciplines, biogeochemistry, soil science, for example, as well as even broader disciplines such as climatology, atmospheric science, earth system science. Ecosystem ecology is in the middle of all of that. And to really become good ecosystem ecologists, to understand ecosystems well, we have to understand a little bit at least about each of those disciplines. In addition, it has a long history. Ecosystem ecology, the findings that were made in the 1700s, in the 1800s, throughout the 1900s, all contribute to modern day ecosystem ecology. With that, I have one thing. As you become ecosystem ecologists and you think about modern ecosystem ecology, make sure you read the old papers. It's important to go back to Liebig, it's important to go back to Coles in the late 1800s and read some of their work so you can understand where the ideas that we have today came from. Even the Odoms. Pick up Odom's textbook, 1960, take a look at it, look through it, and understand how it changed from then till today. And if you read the old papers, you'll have much better context to understand the new papers.